Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for being here at a joint hearing of the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming and the Select Committee on Intelligence and the Subcommittee on Intelligence Community Management. I want to thank Chairman Reyes and Chairwoman Eshoo, Ranking Member Issa, and the rest of the members of the Subcommittee on Intelligence Community Management for joining us today for this important hearing, and Mr. Sensenbrenner, the Ranking Member of the Select Committee on Global Warming, and our members as well. We find ourselves at a critical moment in history. The impacts of our altered atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels are beginning to manifest themselves in the United States and around the world. Our response to this challenge can be to either unleash a technological revolution that will enhance our national economic and environmental security, or to burden the planet with climatic catastrophe. Whether it is floods in Iowa, cyclones in Burma, or drought, starvation, and genocide in Darfur, we know that environmental threats underpin many global conflicts and crises, and that global warming will only make matters worse, and that human beings all over the planet face death or famine or injury if we do not act. The Select Committee's very first hearing focused on the geopolitical implications of our nation's dependence on oil and the impacts of global warming. That inaugural hearing occurred in the same week that the UN Security Council held its first ever discussion on the implications of global warming for international peace and security, and the same week that 11 retired top U.S. military leaders and the Center for Naval Analysis issued the report, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change. We are honored to have two key participants in those efforts with us today. The Honorable Margaret Beckett, the former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, and Vice Admiral Paul Gaffney. One of the key recommendations of the CNA report was for the intelligence community to incorporate the consequences of climate change into a national intelligence estimate. After that first Select Committee hearing, I introduced legislation requiring such an analysis. Through the hard work of Chairwoman Eshoo and her colleagues on the House Intelligence Committee, similar language was included in the House Intelligence Authorization Bill last year. The Director of National Intelligence has since responded with the National Intelligence Assessment finalized earlier this month, and which informs much of today's hearing. Unfortunately, the NIA is classified, and therefore the public cannot benefit from the excellent analysis that the intelligence community has brought together in this report. But make no mistake, this first ever high-level intelligence community study of global warming, which calls the climate crisis a threat to American security, is a clarion call to action from the heart of our nation's security establishment. I understand the reasoning behind the decision of the National Intelligence Council to classify the specific regional security impacts of global warming in this NIA, but I am reserving my judgment as to whether that is the right choice. The science is conclusive. We know that global warming is occurring today, and we know that severe security consequences will result. I believe that our goal must be to marshal the political will to halt and roll back global warming and save the planet from this disaster. The intelligence community is hesitant to tell the world who will be affected, what might happen, and where the greatest security risks will occur. But that's exactly what we need. If people know specifically what those severe security problems will be and where they will be and who they will affect, then perhaps we will finally have enough political will both in this country and internationally to do the hard work of solving the climate crisis. After 7 years of ignoring the problem, the Bush administration continues to limit what their experts can communicate to the public on this critical issue. Whether it is the Environmental Protection Agency or the National Intelligence Council that is sounding the alarm, whether it is a danger to the public or a danger to national security, the President doesn't want America to know the real risks of global warming. I would now like to recognize the gentle lady from California, Ms. Eshoo, for an opening statement, and then I will recognize the two ranking members from the minority.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman. I think that what I'd like to do is to ask the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, because I know he has other commitments this morning, to make his statement, and then I can follow. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Chairwoman Eshoo and Chairman Markey and the ranking members as well for conducting this very important hearing. I think this is vitally important that we provide the forum for all these exceptional witnesses to provide us the information and the benefit of their expertise, because this is an issue that we all realize we have to contend with, whether it's in terms of operational considerations, certainly budget considerations, but most importantly, as a grandfather, the implication that it means for future generations, not just in this country, but throughout the world. So I think this is certainly an important hearing and one of a series of opportunities that we will have as a Congress to factor this issue into everything that we do. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and we'll follow it closely. Thank you.
I thank the chairman very much, and now we continue to yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Chairman Markey, and certainly to the chairman of the full Committee on Intelligence in the House, to all of my colleagues here. A special welcome to our witnesses. I want to start out by noting the historic nature of this hearing today. It's extraordinary because it represents the very first time that the government of the United States is acknowledging the national security implications of global climate change. Many of us have believed for decades that this issue has great national security importance. In the 1990s, then Senator Gore highlighted the issue, and he pushed to keep the issue on the national agenda as vice president. The nation then began using intelligent assets and our allies to collect data on climate change. I think this is a little known fact by many people in our country and people around the world. That, of course, came to a halt in 2001, and I think that it's really being resurrected today to move forward and to really accept one of the great challenges of the 21st century. Outside experts began acknowledging the linkage between the environment and security, and so this hearing today brings the two together with the two committees that have done work on this. This year, Javier Solana, the EU High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy, issued a paper calling for coordinated research on mitigation and on coping strategies for global climate change. In 2007, the German Advisory Council on Global Change argued for the importance of stopping climate change trends. The CNA, advised by 11 former generals and admirals, released an in-depth report on likely security implications, and the Center for Security and International Studies and the Center for a New American Security released a joint report on the same. Last April, after the release of the CNA study, I wrote to the Director of National Intelligence, Mike McConnell, and asked him to undertake a national intelligence estimate of the anticipated geopolitical effects of global climate change and the implications of such effects on the national security of the United States. He responded that it would be, quote, entirely appropriate for the National Intelligence Council to prepare such an assessment. But when we included a requirement for a national intelligence estimate in the Intelligence Authorization Bill, there actually were those that ridiculed the issue on the floor of the House. I think we're coming a long way today. This report should put those doubts to rest. I want to salute our witnesses that have done so much work on this issue and the Director of National Intelligence for their work on this assessment. The NIA is the result of just open source collaboration between the intelligence community and the scientific and academic communities. While I'm pleased with the report's conclusions, I am disappointed, and that disappointment is shared by many of my colleagues, that it is classified confidential. This is the lowest level of classified information, a classification level rarely used, but one that prevents this report from being released and discussed in the public domain. I've often noted that the intelligence community, at least in my view, over-relies on secrecy and classified information. In this instance, I believe that the document should not be classified, and I hope that the DNI will decide to declassify it. The intelligence community accepted the science as a given and without judgment, and still found that there are very serious national security implications. Increased global temperatures mean heavy precipitation events, reduction in glaciers and Arctic ice, and rising sea levels. These climatic events will mean crop failures, water shortages, flooding, coastal storms, and increased incidence of infectious diseases. Each of these leads to instability, and our witnesses, I believe, are going to talk about this. I'm not going to go into the detail of many of them. I also want to add that as many as 48 U.S. coastal military installations are endangered by flooding and associated damage. Now, some would claim that by discussing the implications of global climate change, we're creating a panic because, as someone said, no one can predict the weather. In the law enforcement community, in the emergency response community, we train people for the eventuality of things taking place. In other words, we prepare. And so I believe that we must address the foreseeable consequences, and it's the lack of preparedness that should cause any kind of panic. I would note that in a speech last month, the NATO Secretary General, Jabtahu Keffer, described the greatest security challenges facing the alliance. And he said the following, and I'll close on this. In tomorrow's uncertain world, we cannot wait for threats to mature before deciding how we counter them. The nature of this new environment is already taking shape. It will be an environment that will be marked by the effects of climate change, such as territorial conflicts, rising food prices, and migration. It will be characterized by the scramble for energy resources, by the emergence of new powers, and by non-state actors trying to gain access to deadly technologies. Note that the very first threat he mentioned are the effects of global climate change. There is no question in his mind that the climate change poses a national security challenge, and I think that from this day forward, the words climate change and international security will be forever linked. So I want to thank everyone for being here, especially the wonderful subcommittee that I have the privilege of chairing. And I especially want to point out the wonderful and important work of our staff, Diane Lavoie, Mika Ying, and Josh Rosnick. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of the time that really I don't have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner, the ranking member of the Select Committee on Global Warming.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is the third hearing on the national security implications of climate change that I have attended since this Congress began. It was the topic of the Select Committee's first ever hearing in April 2007, as well as a hearing in the Science Committee last September. Reading through the testimony, it doesn't seem like there's much new information to assess. Much of the information today is based on last year's UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. The conclusions of the IPCC have been studied in great detail by this Congress and warrant further consideration in the next Congress. However, I think the American people want the Congress today to focus on how to reduce gas and energy prices, improve energy security, and to increase domestic energy supplies. The National Intelligence Estimate appears to give a good overview of climate change projections, how they might affect certain regions and nations, and how this will affect the United States. The NIA constructs these projections out to 2030, which is a far shorter time frame than many of the projections in the IPCC report. Much of the worst-case scenarios projected by the IPCC are in the latter half of this century. The national security implications of climate change will cause some concerns, but so do the implications of climate change policies that stand to reduce the availability of cheap, reliable energy sources around the world. Many of the cases detailed in the NIA will have to be dealt with through adaptive measures. As one of our witnesses will point out today, much of the world is not only poor, but energy poor, which makes adaptation much more difficult. The testimony of Marlo Lewis, senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, shows that an estimated 1.6 billion people have no access to electricity at all. Power plants, however fueled, would immeasurably improve these people's lives. Where do they fit into the climate change picture? The testimony of Lee Lane, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, summarizes the complexity of this issue. Mr. Lane notes that the lens of national security might not be the best way to view the issues associated with global warming. Climate change policy will require trade-offs that are unavoidable, including a weakened U.S. economy that could affect how this country handles conflicts. Then Mr. Lane notes that if China and India do not participate in efforts to cut greenhouse gases, worldwide efforts to reduce carbon dioxide concentrations will fail. I agree. And yet efforts to force China and India into compliance will only worsen global conflicts. Mr. Lane is also right to point out that the only way to achieve these greenhouse gas reductions is through the development of new technology, and that in the near term, the focus should be on further developing technologies like nuclear, clean coal, solar, wind, and biomass. These technologies have the potential to produce clear, tangible improvements to the environment, which must be a key part of any climate change policy. These technologies can also help bolster the energy security of the United States, which should be a top priority of the Democratic leadership in Congress. There is perhaps no action that could better help the energy security of the United States than providing access to domestic oil and gas supplies. However, instead of taking this crucial action, Congress today will again talk about the threat of global warming as opposed to the real threats of high energy prices and energy security. I thank the chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, and now the chair recognizes the ranking member of the Intelligence Subcommittee, gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Markey.
There we go. I want to thank Chairman Markey, Madam Chairwoman Eshoo, and Ranking Member Sensenbrenner. Additionally, I want to thank Dr. Fingar and our second panel of witnesses for testifying here today. I come here today with a number of questions and reservations on the recent National Intelligence Assessment on global climate change. Our nation and its intelligence community are facing many serious threats at a time when we are short analysts to assist in finding weapons of mass destruction, terrorist activities. And terrorist activities around the globe. I am concerned that projects like this on climate change and the NIA amount to a dangerous diversion of intelligence resources. I don't say that lightly. I don't make climate change a light issue. The question is not, is it appropriate for us to be concerned about possible climate change and its impacts? Of course not. That is a great concern. Is it appropriate to ask hypothetical questions to the State Department, to the CIA, and others on what will happen if X occurs? All of that is reasonable. We continue to do it, and I would expect on a bipartisan basis we continue to ask those questions so that we can plan and so that we know that the community is doing its planning. What I am concerned about is clearly the CIA and other intelligence agencies do not and should not have the resources of climatologists. I believe that that's probably our greatest threat. I hope today we will look at this in terms of what it is. It is a study of if, in fact, there is drought, if, in fact, there is famine, if, in fact, a number of things occur. It is not a study of will they occur. On that, the science is not settled, although the science is unsettling. Certainly, for all of us who remember a quote, we earlier had quotes, but a quote that goes this way: I believe it is appropriate to have an over-representation of factual presentations on how dangerous it is as a predicate for opening up the audience to listen to what the solutions are. That quote, of course, I have to give credit to Vice President Al Gore. I could go on and give the quotes on Mr. Hansen, Dr. Hansen, who now is a leading advocate on climate change, and some would say an alarmist, when in fact he was also an author of the nuclear winter we were going to receive as of 1971. He was wrong then, or he's wrong now. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about the effects of putting carbon-based fuels into our climate. We should be concerned for a number of reasons. First of all, we don't know the effects. Second of all, the effects we do know include pollution that adversely affects life around the world. Lastly, we know that these are limited resources. In America today, with $135 oil, mostly due to our lack of willingness to produce domestically, we fully understand why our cost is so high, and yet we'd like to have it lower. So I would like to join all of the people on the dais here, I believe, in saying that we have to find alternatives that help drive down the cost of oil, reduce the use of hydrocarbons, and continue the study on it by serious climate-based professors, none of whom, by definition, would normally be in the CIA, in order to find out the real question of when will these events occur, if they will occur, and how we can stop them. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I think the most important thing for us to remember here today is not 7 years ago, not 17 years ago, not 27 years ago, but in 1971 when we began looking at climate and the production of, then it was dust and other particulates, but clearly the effects of burning oil, natural gas, coal, we sounded an alarm. That was at a time in which an answer was open to us, an answer that in my district produces 2,200 megawatts of power, and that was clean-burning nuclear. Today in California, we are prohibited from doing any nuclear, zero emissions. We continue to have an argument throughout that entire period while taking away the solution that the French and the European Union and others have sought, which is, well, we don't know the effects of burning carbon-based in some areas, we do in others, knowing that in fact it is not good to burn coal and others from a particulate standpoint if we can avoid it, knowing that there are over 1 billion people without electricity around the world. Not this committee, but this Congress should dedicate itself to quickly freeing up the prohibition on nuclear so that in fact we can get off carbon-based electricity in this country, dramatically reducing our carbon footprint, something we can do today. We can do it in a matter of 5 or 6 years. It will do more by far than other things that we are looking at the present time, or any other thing we're looking at the present time. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to have my entire statement put in the record, and would like to move on so we can get to our panelists.
Without objection.
I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. That completes the time for opening statements. Now I recognize Chairwoman Eshoo for the purpose of introducing our first panel of witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now I'd like to introduce our very distinguished first panel. Dr. Thomas Fingar is the Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analysis and Chairman of the National Intelligence Council, or the NIC, which provides the President and senior policymakers with intelligence analyses on strategic issues. Analytic reports produced by the NIC have been reviewed and coordinated throughout the intelligence community. Dr. Fingar will describe the approach that the intelligence community has used to produce the National Intelligence Assessment, or the NIA, on the security implications of global climate change. And he will present a summary of the intelligence community's key observations on the subject. However, the NIA, as we stated previously, the NIA itself remains classified at the confidential level. Accompanying Dr. Fingar from the NIC are Dr. Matt Burrows, the NIC's counselor, who has been key in the drafting of the NIA, and Ms. Karen Monacan, the National Intelligence Officer for Economics, who's responsible for the NIA's analysis of food and other resources, amongst other issues. I'm also very happy to welcome Rolf Mowat Larson, the Director of the Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence in the Department of Energy, which is one of the 16 agencies that make up the intelligence community. So many people think that there's one agency that makes up the intelligence community, the CIA. There are 15 others. He heads up one of the 16 agencies. This office is responsible for the national laboratories of the Department of Energy, which will need to play an increasingly important role in assessing and mitigating the security impacts of climate change. And also of interest is that the office has pursued a collaborative approach in working with other countries on energy and climate as a global security issue, an approach that relies on open source, unclassified information. So, Dr. Fingar, we look forward to your prepared statement and to the opportunity to discuss this important topic with you and your colleagues, and we also want to thank you for your very special leadership. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairman Markey, Chairwoman Eshoo, members of the committees, thank you for this opportunity to brief your committees on the national security implications of global climate change to 2030. We've submitted a statement for the record that provides considerable detail on the study and its conclusions. As you requested, I will provide only a brief summary, but I ask that the full statement be included in the record.
Without objection, it will be included.
The just completed National Intelligence Assessment that undergirds our statement for the record was a new and challenging venture for the intelligence community. Our ultimate objective was to assess the national security implications for the United States of global climate change. In order to do so, we had to reach outside the intelligence community for expertise on climate science, on how projected changes would affect specific countries. We did not address mitigation nor make any judgments about costs or future technologies. The approach we adopted had 4 stages. Stage 1 was to establish a starting point. Since the intelligence community does not conduct climate research, we turned to other U.S. government organizations with the requisite expertise, including the U.S. Climate Change Science Program and climate modelers and experts for the Department of Energy National Laboratories and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Our primary source for climate projections was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 4th Assessment Report. We relied primarily on the report's mid-range projections. Stage 2 was to assess how global climate change projections would impact specific countries. For this stage, we commissioned parallel studies by the Joint Climate Change Research Institute, a collaborative research program of the University of Maryland and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and Columbia University Center for International Earth Science Information Network. Both teams examined how projected climate change would affect water scarcity, populations at risk from sea level rise, and overall vulnerability to climate change in approximately 60 countries. The countries examined did not include highly developed countries with the economic, technical, and political capacity to cope with the effects of climate change between now and 2030. The results of Stage 2 were reviewed by country and regional specialists convened by the National Intelligence Council and the Naval Postgraduate School. The goal was to assess the ability of each of the countries and regions to cope with the projected impacts. The results of Stage 3 assessment provided the basis for the intelligence community's examination of how the results of projected climate change would affect U.S. national security interests to 2030. The fourth stage of the study assumed that climate change will occur as forecast by the IPCC report, and that it will affect specific countries as projected in stages 2 and 3. We chose 2030 as the end point because it is far enough in the future to see physical and biological effects of climate change, but close enough to allow judgments about the likely impact of such changes. I will now summarize briefly the key conclusions of our assessment. Our analysis found three primary paths through which the effects of climate change could impact national security: water scarcity, decreased agricultural productivity, and infrastructure damage. Water scarcity and decreased agricultural productivity can trigger human migration. Regardless of whether the migration is inter- or intrastate, it could cause or exacerbate tensions between the migrants and the receiving population. Damage to infrastructure resulting from increases in the frequency or intensity of severe weather events could have significant economic costs and add to social and political tensions. Social tensions and economic costs could lead to state or regional instability threatening U.S. interests. We judge that global climate change will have wide-ranging implications for U.S. national security interest over the next 20 years because it will aggravate existing problems such as poverty, social tensions, environmental degradation, ineffectual leadership, and weak political institutions. All of these threaten domestic stability in a number of African, Asian, Central American, and Central Asian countries. We assess that climate change alone is unlikely to trigger state failure in any state during the period to 2030, but it could contribute to inter- and more likely intra-state conflicts, particularly over access to increasingly scarce water resources. We also judge that climate change effects could prompt migration in search of better living conditions, both within nations and from disadvantaged to more affluent countries. Climate-induced or exacerbated tensions will be a major contributor to instability in several areas of Africa, where many countries are already challenged by persistent poverty, frequent natural disasters, weak governance, and high dependence on rainfall for agricultural yields. In Asia, current research indicates that extensive parts of South, Southeast, and East Asia will face risks of decreased agricultural productivity, floods, and droughts. By 2025, cereal crop yields will decrease by 2.5 to 10%, according to some calculations. Projections indicate that as many as 50 million additional people could be at risk of hunger by 2020. Most developed nations and countries with rapidly growing economies are likely to fare better than those in the poorer developing world, largely because of greater coping capacity. Nevertheless, many regional states important to the United States could experience negative consequences. Rapidly developing states could experience economic setbacks and uneven growth leading to political instability. Most U.S. allies will experience negative consequences, but also have the means to cope with the projected effects of climate change out to 2030. Some countries will benefit from climate change effects, including those in the Northern Hemisphere, where temperature increases will lengthen growing seasons and facilitate access to energy and other resources. Most of North America in the mid-latitudes will be less affected by climate change in the next few decades than either the tropics or the polar regions. Most studies suggest the United States as a whole will enjoy modest economic benefits from increased crop yields, but the Southwest will have serious water problems, and the East Coast could be subject to more severe weather. Current infrastructure design criteria and construction codes may be inadequate for climate change, increasing vulnerability to heightened storm intensity and flooding. A number of coastal military installations in the continental United States are at significant risk of damage from storm surge-induced flooding. 24 nuclear facilities and numerous refineries along U.S. coastlines are at risk. Mr. Chairman, this brief outline presents a summary at the 50,000-foot level, but I hope it's given you a clear understanding of how we conducted the study and the nature of the implications for the United States. My colleagues would now be very happy to provide additional details in response to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fingar. And I want to congratulate you, first of all, on the National Intelligence Assessment. It is a first-class product. Our nation is indebted to you and your team. You have done a very good job here in laying out this problem for our country and for the planet. And I think it's already had a major impact on the debate about how this country must act aggressively to combat the threat of global warming. In your testimony, you conclude that global warming will multiply existing problems internationally, including social tension, environmental degradation, ineffectual leadership, weak political institutions, poverty, scarcity of resources, and large-scale migration. That, to me, sounds like a laundry list of the underlying causes of terrorism. Could global warming worsen the very problems that are underlying and driving the terrorism problem today?
First of all, thank you for the positive comments on the National Intelligence Assessment, and I will certainly pass them to the people that did most of the heavy lifting on this project. The summary of conditions that you provided and that is in our statement is very similar to the list of conditions and preconditions for alienation that appear to be at work in some cases of recruitment into terrorist activity. So I think logic suggests that the conditions exacerbated by the effects of climate change could increase the pool of potential recruits into terrorist activity.
And from your perspective, is this additional contribution to terrorism something that the United States should be concerned about and take action to prevent?
We should certainly be concerned about any factors, any instance, any areas in which recruitment of people to terrorist activities is occurring. So my short answer would be yes.
As you look at Somalia and Darfur, do you believe that those were areas where this did actually contribute to the rise in tension amongst different groups and as a result increased the national security concerns of the United States?
If you're drawing the linkage from drought here as a climate change exacerbated factor, drought is certainly one of the factors in the unstable situation in Sudan, in Darfur, but only one of those. The clashes that are partly religious, partly ethnic, partly economic, partly the strivings of people for the ability to live in a very difficult situation, all are a factor in creating a terrible humanitarian situation. To my knowledge, we have not had instances of large-scale recruitment or attempts to recruit for terrorist activity out of this particular population.
You mentioned that the intelligence community has done very little work on assessing the implications of climate mitigation strategies, whether they are carbon capture and sequestration, renewables, biofuels, or nuclear. I really don't understand the conclusion drawn on page 7 of your testimony that, quote, efforts to develop mitigation and adaptation strategies to deal with climate change may affect U.S. national security interests even more than the physical impacts of climate change itself. If we haven't analyzed mitigation strategies yet, where does the conclusion that doing the work to avoid global warming would be even worse than global warming itself? Is that sentence from page 7 in the classified national intelligence assessment, or was this added to your testimony at some later point?
No, it is a part of the reason that we have planned follow-on studies to look at mitigation effects. The operative word is may. We don't know. We don't know what effects efforts to expand nuclear power will have on proliferation possibilities. We don't know what effect mitigation efforts in one country may have on conditions in a second or a third country. That, for example, mitigation effects in India that could affect perhaps adversely conditions in Pakistan. So that's the reason the sentence is there. We think it is important to take proposed remediation activities and look at them so that we can provide judgments that we cannot make at this time.
But if we read that conclusion on page 7, you get a totally flawed and false view of what the NIA, which is a hugely important document, actually concluded. I've seen the classified document, and this idea that our attempts to avoid global warming could be more damaging to U.S. national security than global warming itself is simply not there. We've seen this administration politicize intelligence before, and it looks like they have done it here again, not you, sir, of course, by inserting in your testimony this statement that is simply not supported by the intelligence and which is, in fact, completely misleading. Clearly, we need to have the NIA declassified in full so that it can be read and debated without being filtered through the White House. This White House wants to debate how we should address and mitigate the climate crisis. We welcome that debate because it's the White House, not the Congress, that wants to send nuclear power reactors to Saudi Arabia in the most unstable region in the world in the name of global warming. There will, I guarantee you, be a severe security implication to this country in the form of uncontrolled nuclear proliferation from that absurd policy. So I think it's important for us to have it out on the table if sending nuclear power plants to Saudi Arabia is the administration's argument that they're making in a climate change context. Again, I thank all of you at the table for the leadership.
If I may respond briefly, Mr. Chairman, for the record, to note that the White House had no involvement in the production of either the National Intelligence Assessment or the statement for the record, other than the statement for the record with the normal OMB review process. This is the judgment of the intelligence community.
Did OMB ask for any changes in the language of your testimony today?
Not in that portion of it.
Let me turn then and recognize the ranking member of the Select Committee, the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fingar, am I correct in assuming that the National Intelligence Estimate was based exclusively on the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change?
No, sir, you're not correct in that.
Okay.
We took as a starting point the IPCC fourth report. We added to that peer-reviewed scientific materials produced in the years since that report was produced. We consulted with a variety of U.S. government and academic specialists on it. But we did not attempt to evaluate the climate science. That review and supplementing of it said that reflected a reasonable scientific projection. the IPCC report is at a global level, which doesn't provide very much useful information on how individual nations, subcomponents of nations, sectors of the economy, agricultural crops, and so forth. For that kind of detail, we turn to the two commissioned studies.
Several weeks ago, there was an article that appeared in Nature magazine that said for approximately the next decade, we will be experiencing a period of global cooling. Was any of the information in the Nature article put into the National Intelligence Assessment, or did that article come out too late for it to be of use to you?
Other than the experts that we consulted may have seen it and factored it into their analysis, but we did not use it.
Well, given the fact that the computerized projections that the IPCC used would come up with a significantly different result if even there was a 1/10 of a degree cooling or a 1/10 of a degree warming, and greater than that if the variations were different either up or down. How would the National Intelligence Estimate or National Intelligence Assessment change if the IPCC projections ended up being proven wrong because of changes in actual observed temperatures, either upwards or downwards?
We can't answer that question, sir.
Okay.
Because we took as the starting point projected change. If change occurs in ways that are different than our assessments based on the projection of the individual countries and then a projection of the coping capacity of those countries and then on national security, would have to change. But again, the starting point for this was the climate science report of the IPCC that had been peer-reviewed, including in parts of the U.S. government. That if that's wrong, then what follows is wrong.
Well, I think that makes the point that many of us on this side of the aisle are making, is that even a small error on the part of the IPCC projections compared to what is actually observed now and in the future is going to make all of this debate really irrelevant in terms of how we deal with the issue. I think we're going to be hearing pretty soon that many of the people who have been involved in this effort for quite a while were predicting a nuclear winter and global cooling as late as 25 to 30 years ago. And in terms of making decisions that would have a major impact on our economy, one that would weaken our economy at a time when it's not too strong, it seems to me that we ought to stop and think through things, because if we make decisions now and it's based on imprecise data or projections that are wrong, there will be a lot of people hurt very unnecessarily. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman, and Chair recognizes the gentlelady, the Chair of the Intelligence Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think first, Dr. Fingar, thank you for your testimony and the written testimony that all of the members have in their binders and have read. I think that the early questions so far really are indicative and point out the two different pictures that are painted of the whole issue of climate change. That there were scientists that did great work decades ago, and based on what they knew then, made projections. Now it's being said that, gee, they made projections and they got into something and they weren't exactly right. So this is not a sure science, and so let's set this aside and let's do something else. I don't belong to that school of thought, and I'm not. I say this with sincerity because I really respect the ranking member of the Select Committee, Mr. Sensenbrenner. He was part of the trip to the congressional delegation that the Speaker led on climate change to India, and was a real asset to that effort. I think it's important to lay down once again that the intelligence community has not done, are not the researchers of the science. They have accepted the science that has been put forward by a variety of agencies and experts and have moved out to make their comments as a result of their study and the NIC, producing the NIA, on the whole issue of how this impacts not only our national security, but how it brings about international insecurities. So now my question to you is quite a broad one, and that is, what in your view comes next? Should there be a team that's put together in our intelligence community? It seems to me that we cannot and have not been able to do effective work, our own intelligence community, without working with other intelligence communities around the world. We strengthen our own ranks and our own efforts, and certainly bring a great deal to theirs, and the international bodies that I lifted some quotes from their leaders from in my opening statement. So can you give us your view of what you believe are the next steps that need to be taken?
Okay.
And what mechanisms you think exist today, or do we need to design new ones? So that's my question. And thank you again for your superb work.
Thank you. And thank you for your confidence in asking such an ambitious question. Additional work clearly is required on climate science. In my judgment, that work is best done in other agencies of the United States government other than the intelligence community, where the expertise and the access, the contacts with international scientists, counterparts, research institutions around the globe, since this is a global problem involving existing international mechanisms to continue to work the climate science issues. That climate change is an issue on which intelligence, covertly, clandestinely acquired information, is not very helpful. We can't steal Mother Nature's intentions. And I'm being a little facetious, but the fact of the matter is we don't have a body of classified information that would be significant in size and certainly not different in kind to that which is available in other places. Where we plan to focus next within the intelligence community, based on what we have learned out of the study just completed, is to drill deeper into the effects on individual countries. One of the things that we discovered in doing this study is that for much of the world, data doesn't exist with a granularity that is really needed to make confident assessments. So an effort needs to be made to acquire that data. We're going to drill down in selected countries. A second focus will be look at the great power implications of the climate change's effects forecast here. Russia,
What did you say? You said, oh, great powers.
Russia perhaps benefiting, the United States benefiting but having some deleterious impacts. China and India are in the countries that will experience over the time frame.
In other words, there are winners and losers.
There are winners and
for
losers
nations.
in this, and some of them are very big and important global players. What are the implications for cooperation, for competition, for resources, and the like? That's a subject for for future study.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The chair
The third area would look at some of the mitigation strategies that have been proposed. We didn't do it the first time, but begin asking, how would that change things?
Great. Thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask a question in a little bit the abstract, but not too much. If I was to say that there are ominous signs that the Earth's weather patterns have begun to change dramatically, and that these changes have portend a drastic decline in food production, were serious political implications for just about every nation on Earth. The drop in food output could begin quite soon, and perhaps in only 10 years from now. The regions of decline that would feel the greatest impact would be the wheat production of Canada and Russia. But additionally, areas on the margin and only marginally self-sufficient, tropical areas in Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Africa, where growing seasons depend on rains brought by the monsoon. Would you say that that was, at least in part, essentially what we painted for you with this global climate change as a potential that you had to deal with in your analysis? Dr. Fingar. I mean, I know that's not the exact words of any of the studies, but isn't that essentially what we painted for you, is that that global climate change, to begin in as little as 10 years, going out to 2030, would have these kinds of effects in many of the areas I named?
I guess three comments. One is we took as a starting point a set of projections. We took the mid-range projections, which
No, I appreciate that on the study, Doctor.
Are not as extreme as was done there, but that our starting point was a set of projections and scenarios about how climate change would affect the physical and the biological world.
No, I appreciate that, but as you said, you're not climatologists. You don't have them on staff. You had to reach out to even to get what the projections were. What I read you was, as far as I can tell, similar to what you're dealing with as the hypothetical. Change beginning in as little as 10 years, droughts, marginal areas not being able to meet food demands. True or false?
What I'm having difficulty with is the word hypothetical.
Well, let me be less hypothetical. You were between your undergraduate and graduate years in 1975. I think you were a PhD candidate when that was written. That was written based on global cooling. The projections for global cooling, Newsweek, Science, full page, 1975, were that those things would occur, that marginal areas, areas having less technology, less able to cope with, such as Indochina then, the Soviet Union, Canada, based on their wheat, because wheat harvests don't do very well as it warmed in that case, and certainly the areas along the equator, if they stopped getting the rain that came with monsoons, that would adversely affect and lead to instability. Now, your study today, based on the opposite, or the studies you accepted based on the opposite, have the same effect. My point here today is the problems of 1975 based on global cooling and the problems here based on global warming appear to be the same problems. Wouldn't you agree that, in fact, if you have a change of 7 or 8 degrees and a change in how much water falls where, marginal areas, up or down, were going to be affected, and affected fairly dramatically? Isn't that true?
I can't argue that it isn't true.
Okay, well then following up, no, because I have very limited time and I just want to get to just one single point in this. I appreciate what the intelligence community brings to us. For purposes, this is a committee on global climate change mixed with a committee on intelligence. For purposes of intelligence, no matter what we give you in hypotheticals, a rise of 7 degrees, a fall of 7 degrees, inability to grow crops in India because they burn cow dung and the sky doesn't allow enough sun to get in. Whatever the hypothetical we give you, isn't it true that you are prepared, and that one thing that we can count on is that you will give us some analysis of what will happen if, but in fact, you cannot really feed accurately within your resources of any of the intelligence agencies the input of whether the temperature is going to go up or down, whether the temperature is going to cause or not cause a drought. What you can do is deal with any hypothetical we give you as to global climate change and come back to us and say, yes, if you cut off the water in X country, or if this country has a crop failure, we can give you an analysis of the impact to America's security and the stability of those countries. Isn't that essentially what the relationship that we should have with your agency?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, and
If the question is posed as what would be the implications of make up the hypothetical or pick the scientific study, what would change would be sort of confidence level about whether it was purely hypothetical or was grounded in real-world experience and the quality, as judged by those able to do so,
Right.
of the underlying science.
And Doctor, I hated to make it as painful as it was, but it is very important. I appreciate the chair's indulgence. It is very important. I appreciate that you and the agency, that all of the agencies of the intelligence community are very good at giving us these hypotheticals and not qualified per se to look into climate change, but rather given a set of scenarios that might occur, giving us a reasonable projection, and as you said, and I think very importantly, Mr. Chairman, that we delve into it deeper, that the very mitigations, we have to analyze whether those mitigations have side effects. Appreciate the chairman's indulgence and yield back the time I also don't have.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair. I appreciate your putting this hearing together. Just to follow the line of questioning from this morning for just a moment longer, let me ask Dr. Fingar why you chose the IPCC judgments, and I gather this was not just a randomly selected essay that somebody tossed off the top of their head, and that you, as I recall from reading the assessment, you actually subjected it to some analysis about how conservative it was or how far out it was.
I'll invite Matt to answer that.
All right.
We selected the IPCC fourth assessment as well as other. We selected the IPCC's fourth assessment report as well as other peer-reviewed scientific material because first IPCC report was peer-reviewed and accepted by the U.S. government. So it was, in our minds, the consensus document by which to use as a base then for analyzing the security implications of climate change.
Thank you. The other question I'd like to pursue, and I'm sure there won't be time to exhaust it, but it's something that Dr. Fingar, you and I have discussed before. It's the implications for the way we do and collect intelligence, collect and analyze intelligence in the United States. For 50 years, partly because of the Cold War mentality and for various other reasons, our intelligence, both the budget, the directives, and the way the analysts think has been oriented toward politico-military issues. It's all been, you know, in shorthand we might say we've been practicing Kremlinology, trying to get inside the political dynamics in the world. You said you had to use a different methodology in putting this together. I wonder if we shouldn't be using that different methodology more often in more other areas, because by focusing on the politico-military dynamics, we can sometimes miss things that are perhaps of even greater import.
I absolutely agree with you on two dimensions, maybe more, but two specifically. One is thinking about our national interest or national security in ways that are broader than they were in the past, and certainly the range of questions that are posed to the intelligence community now come from a much wider spectrum of U.S. government agencies, and the old way of doing things is inadequate to new problems. The other is the reaching out for information that is not inherently sensitive or classified because we stole it, because we use very sophisticated methods to achieve it. Engaging with experts inside and outside of the United States government, inside and outside of the United States, has become, is an increasingly important and now soon to be mandated by D.N.I. McConnell as a part of what is expected of all analysts in the community.
So I gather part of this different methodology that you recommend means a better use, more integrated use of open source information.
Absolutely.
You're alluding to the fact that in the intelligence community there is this belief, a fallacious belief, I must say, that hard-won information, in other words, information gained surreptitiously or through expensive national technical means, is somehow better information than you might get. It's certainly harder won, but it's not necessarily better than what you can get from open sources. My time is expiring,
I
but I
absolutely
thank
agree
you.
with that observation.
I thank you for your observation. Thank you.
Did you want to add something, Dr. Finger?
No, but if I may beg the chair's indulgence, I am watching the clock because I have an airplane to catch. So if it becomes necessary for me to turn it over to my colleagues, please indulge. I thought we were going to end at 11 o'clock, and then it had scheduled around that.
Let me now turn and recognize the gentleman from
Thank you.
Oregon, Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Finger, what level of confidence do you have in your assessment? What level of confidence do you apply to this assessment?
The confidence level we have applied is sort of low to moderate. The reason being the cascade of uncertainties. There is uncertainty about the climate change projections that we took as the baselines. There was uncertainty about the impact on the individual countries. There were uncertainties about the judgments of the experts we consulted about the ability of different countries and regions to cope with them. So with that cascade of uncertainties gives us a bottom line of low to moderate.
Of low to moderate on your assessment. So as we read this, the public version of this document, we should assume that your confidence level behind it is low to moderate.
Correct.
Why publish something at that level? I understand the answer. I was hoping to get it from him. Dr. Finger, why publish at that level? Can you stand behind this report?
We will stand behind it. We will stand behind the methodology we used, and one of the reasons I used as much of the time of my initial presentation to lay out that methodology so people would understand what we did in order to reach the conclusions. And again, just to close the loop, if you meant publish in the sense of public, we were asked to present an unclassified statement for the record. The National Intelligence Assessment is classified.
All right. Now let me switch gears, because when I think of national security and global climate change and all of these issues, I also see the issue of food security and energy security. Being able to grow crops. I represent a very arid part of Oregon, 70,000 square miles, where, you know, the line, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. has gone on for 100 years. And I sense in global climate change, as part of what's in the public report, is you're going to have different moisture regimes, which will affect crops, which will affect food stocks, correct? And what you've done is take the published data, scientific data, analyze that and try to apply it on a country-by-country basis to determine what we could anticipate happening in those countries with the known science of global climate change. And to all of that, you apply the low to moderate confidence level in your findings, correct?
To the assessment we make of the national security implications for the United States. It's the bottom of that cascade.
Okay, then when we're talking about the national security interests of the United States, as I watch the food price crisis around the world, as I watch the energy crisis here in this country and around the world, as I talk to my constituents, the farmers and ranchers who provide a lot of the food that is frankly exported in terms of wheat and other grains around the world, it seems to me that our energy lack of independence in the United States, the price of oil, fertilizer, and other inputs is having a very significant impact on stability around the world. And then you look at the money we're sending to, Hugo Chavez at $130 million a day for oil out of Venezuela, the money going into China and Russia. Is that not also a security issue that may be even larger than what we're facing with global climate change? It seems to me that the Chinese and the Russians are becoming more financially independent at our price because we're sending the money for oil and all to them. Aren't they building up their militaries? Doesn't that provide a bigger issue we should be focused on?
It's a different issue.
I know that.
I'm unable to size in a comparative way.
So you think global climate change issues are equal then? Is that what you're saying to what we're seeing unfold today on the energy picture?
Well, I'll invite.
Yeah, maybe
Wolf
somebody
to
else,
comment
Ms.
on the energy.
Monahan?
Well, I would agree with your principal contention that it's very useful to look at the climate issue in the context of energy, obviously. In fact, I'd go so far to say they're more or less a single equation of state. As you change energy policy, it will have positive or negative environmental consequences, including on global warming. In fact, I would use a quote that maybe captures one element of that from the World Economic Forum Global Futures Report from this year. They stated the failure to develop a holistic policy approach to management of both energy security and reducing carbon emissions may end up threatening both objectives. And I think, of course, that will also affect, as we look into the future on this issue, the kinds of confidence we have in our analysis will depend largely on the variability of the studies.
Do you analyze?
I hate to interrupt only because Mr. Fingar has to leave, and I would like some of the other members, so the gentleman's time has expired. I apologize to you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I thank you for being here to provide testimony, and I just want to add my thanks to all the people behind putting together this work. The estimates are of fabulous help to us, and I appreciate all the good work that goes into it. And I just want to point out that in all of your estimates are based more often than not on judgments. Your judgments are based on certain uncertainties, and that's kind of the nature of the business that you're in. And I think it needs to be pointed out that when you label something a certain confidence level, that's an accumulation of everything. That there's parts of your work that have higher confidence ratings than others, as I understand it from my position on the Intelligence Committee. So I think that needs to be pointed out in the beginning. But I too had concerns about the IPCC's findings and wanted to know whether or not these are things that we could take to the proverbial bank. I met with a group of scientists from one of the universities in my district, University of California at Davis, an agricultural institution, and all the scientists I met with, they just kind of shrugged. They said, well, of course this is good stuff. You just have to remember it's a consensus report. So this is kind of like the lowest common denominator. They were they were already at the point where this was accepted. And I also want to point out that the private sector is certainly in my district is interested in this type of work. I represent an area that the main crop, agricultural district, that main crop is wine grapes for wine production. And every winery and every vineyard operation in my district on their own is out trying to figure out how to reduce their carbon footprint. They know it's good for business. They know it's good for their survival. And they look at things like the increase in temperature, and already the warming in California, the increased temperatures in California have already responsible for the introduction of, they claim, 2 new pests per month. And this has an impact on the business. And the private sector is going out there. They're installing solar panels. They're burning different types of fuel, different types of farming practices. They're investing a lot of money out of pocket because they know that this is important. And a lot of it's based on data that has been made available. And it seems to me that we should be looking at how to make all of the data available so everybody, governments, not only local governments and state governments here, but governments around the world, we can work in conjunction with them to deal with what would be devastating geopolitical problems if this comes about. And I guess I'd like to hear from you, Dr. Fingar, regarding the making public, declassifying this information so we can have the benefit of working across agencies, working across governments, working globally to deal with this.
Let me respond to three points that you made. One is the intelligence community used to working with uncertainty, working with partial information. That's what we do all the time. That's why we exist. If we had all of the information, wouldn't need to hire us. So we're used to trying to piece together a 1,000-piece puzzle when we have 15 pieces and somebody lost the box cover. Dealing with the uncertainties around the IPCC report, okay, that's what we know, in quotes, and as a starting point. So we will take that and work with it. So in that respect, what we did here is what we normally do on a different kind of subject, and difficulty to go back at the sources of the information. The peer review character is important to this. It is a the IPCC report is peer reviewed. We buy pharmaceuticals, farmers apply fertilizer, all on the basis of sort of peer reviewed scientific papers of one kind or another. It's not just another hypothesis. That the classification of the NIA is one that there's several reasons here. It was not a NIC decision. The decision to have us classify was the National Intelligence Board, which are the heads of the 16 agencies meeting together, chaired by the Director of National Intelligence. And part of it is we're reluctant to have our input to decision making become a part of the debate. We believe decision makers need the chance to work it. The issues, the problems that are identified in our assessment here are such that if they're going to be tackled, there is going to be extensive engagement by the United States, many components of the United States, with other governments, with international agencies. And our experience and our judgment is that we would complicate and make that much more difficult if we were to sort of identify who are the winners, who stand to benefit if nothing happens, which governments we consider to be too incompetent to manage the problem. Do we direct money to the most competent or the most incompetent, where there are the most people affected or likely to have the shortest term? There are many, many sort of policy decisions that it seemed to me could be informed by this report, and that stigmatizing in some way the potential partners by the judgments that we make about them strikes us as the wrong way to go about it.
gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Hoekstra.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions or comments. Low to moderate means you don't know. I mean, we've read national intelligence estimates where they're high confidence and those types of things, and they've proven to be wrong. And even under high confidence, it says, you know, we could still be wrong. Low to moderate means that, I believe that's accurate, correct? You really don't know.
Yes, it means
I mean,
we do not-
it's a pretty
this-
low standard.
This is not a fact.
But it's a very
this is
low
a
standard in
judgment.
terms of the rankings as to what we see in national intelligence estimates or
Correct.
assessments.
But one of the things that's important, as you will appreciate being on the intelligence community, in the estimates where the confidence levels are based on the quantity and quality of the information we have available. That's the basic.
Right. So it
With
says,
those kinds of criteria, trying to take it out, it's a different kind of information. We've got a lot of information which we are incapable ourselves of assessing the quality.
the second, what value exactly did the intel community add to this process in terms of human collection, signet collection, you know, clandestine collection? Where was the value that the intel community added in this?
There is, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but there's no clandestine collection involved in this. This is working with open source information, and the value was the experienced of analysts who know how to look at national security implications of various situations, country specialists, region specialists, economic specialists, military specialists, who were able to look at the data that came out of stage 3.
We don't have that at state?
You have some, of course.
I mean,
expertise
in
at
terms of
state.
in terms of taking a look at global trends and these types of things, the intelligence community is in a better position to do that kind of analysis on global trends than what we have in the State Department.
I don't know if the Congress asked the State Department for this. They asked us to do it. You asked us to do it.
Why can this report not be declassified?
I don't have anything to add to the answer I just gave your colleague from California.
I mean, I support the chairman of this select committee in terms of asking for the report to be declassified, because I don't see anything that the intel community has added to this study. I don't see any disclosure of clandestine, covert information, as far as I can tell. And I would welcome this report to be studied or to be released to see how little value I think was received as an output of perhaps good work by the intel community, but tasking the wrong people to do the work. I am all for releasing this. I'm
I think
assuming
there's a bipartisan sensibility on this.
Yeah, I mean, I see no intel value that came out of this report that says, wow, we really need to protect these sources, methods,
Will the
or
gentleman
process.
yield?
Yeah.
I agree that this should be declassified as well, based on Dr. Fingar's testimony, that there wasn't any clandestine information that added value to the report.
Yeah, as far as, I mean, I've said this from the beginning. We're asking the wrong agency to do the wrong work. There are other more pressing intelligence needs that are out there right now, and I would apologize for Congress asking you to do this work in the first place. This could have been, as you've said, most of this is open source information. You've gone through it, you've reviewed it, and you said, hey, if there's climate change, and as my colleague pointed out, if temperatures go up, we've got a problem. If temperatures go down, we've got a problem. And you know, and we can say that with low to moderate confidence. There are a lot more pressing issues out there for the intelligence community to be focused on right now that would help keep America safe, and that would actually enable the intelligence community to do what I think we're spending $40 billion a year on, and it's not speculating on open source information. It is it was a waste of time, a waste of resources, for the intelligence community to be focused on this issue versus other folks in the government that could have done this job and have a responsibility for doing it. I'm assuming we didn't go. Did we task anybody to go into these countries and to ask whether countries were developing strategies potentially to deal with global warming in these areas?
We did not.
What's that?
We did not.
I mean, I would think that's what we'd want to know is, does Russia, do countries in Africa, are they thinking about global warming? Are they tasking and developing plans to deal with global warming, instability? If they are, what those are? That's what I think would be of interest from the intelligence community, saying, get into these governments and see how they're planning on dealing with it, because that would be the insight that the intel community could give us that we can't get from open sourcing, but it appears that that didn't even happen. So with that, I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr.
Chairman,
Gentleman from California.
at this juncture, I would ask, as a unanimous consent, that the chairs and the ranking members prepare at the end of the conclusion a request for a declassification, and in lieu of declassification, if that's turned down, that we have a redacted version so that all of us on the committee can see what, if anything, is being held this close, because clearly the vast majority of this document, if not the entire document, should be declassified.
I thank the gentleman for that suggestion, and I would propose that we do work together jointly as committees and majority and minority in order to accomplish that goal. I thank the gentleman for that proposal.
Mr. Chairman, if I may beg your permission to catch my airplane, my colleagues would, but we would certainly receive the committees, the joint two committees.
Could I ask
request.
you, Dr. Fingar, if you could just answer questions from one more member before you leave? Is that possible? I mean, I know it might be. Is it a classified time that your flight is leaving?
No, it's a 12:30 flight.
A 12:30 flight. Well, I think out of courtesy to the gentleman, I apologize to the members. We thank you, Dr.
But my colleagues are very well equipped.
Could I just have, before you do leave, sir, do you stand by the conclusions in the National Intelligence
Yes, I do.
Assessment?
Yes, I do. And I would pick up on my exchange with Congressman Holt, that the fact that the material we used in this was not classified does not lessen the significance of having the intelligence community analytic capabilities arrayed against it. Information is information. Knowledge is knowledge. That how we get it and so forth is less important than does it inform our judgments. And I absolutely stand behind this, both the statement and the assessment.
Thank you, Doctor, very much, and thank you for your contributions
Thank
to
you.
the security of our country.
Thank you, Madam
so
Chairman.
much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Fingar, for being with us today. Appreciate it. Because of the international nature of intelligence, how would you gauge the sharing of information between the U.S. and allied nations, particularly as it relates to this issue, climate change and security? But I mean, the point I'm making is we obviously have to depend on other nations as we secure intelligence. Is that a free-flowing, or is that a difficult proposition?
In terms of this study, we did share the analysis with our Commonwealth partners and also solicit their comments and reactions to it at several different stages. We also have had also interaction with other services in other countries on this issue. So I can,
Well, are we perceived, as best as you can determine, as 21st century thinkers with regard to climate change? Are we perceived around the world with our allies as 21st century thinkers?
You're talking about the intelligence community? Or
yes.
Certainly on this issue, I mean, they were very interested in our analysis, and for the most part shared and agreed with the conclusions of it.
What, either any one of you, what is do you believe to be the greatest threat to national security caused by the effects of climate change?
Well, I think as Dr. Fingar indicated in his remarks, and we put in the statement for the record, it's the fact that it has this cascading effect on other problems. So it's really the confluence of climate change and the impacts in various parts of the world with what are already existing problems, and there's a long list of these that he mentioned in his statement. You know, poverty, some marginal agricultural production to begin with, migration issues, and so on. So it's actually the intersection of climate change with these others that is the most troublesome in terms of.
I read an article recently where the writer was talking about the problems we're going to have with water. They talked about the fact that Lake Mead in California would probably be bone dry in 12 years, and they said there would probably be wars fought over water, or conflicts fought over water. The Nile, the Jordan. Is that an exaggeration?
It's an exaggeration in the sense it's not inevitable. I mean, in fact, on water, these disputes have existed in some ways for some time. I mean, we detail actually in the report some pre-existing water problems. The key is if you have an institutional mechanism in place for sorting out water disputes. I mean, that then decreases the risk of a conflict happening. So it's correct to say that these could be water, who siphons off water, how much water, scarcity. There is all these factors increase the risk of tensions and conflict, but it's not, I don't think, fair to say that that conflict is inevitable just because you have these facts occurring.
Thank you. Yield back 28 seconds, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman very much, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and appreciate the time. And to the panel, thank you very much for your service and the report. I'd like to focus. I'm a member of both the Intelligence Committee and Armed Services Committee. I'd like to focus my first question on the declassification decision and drill down a little bit there. Mr. Moat Larson, I appreciate your service to our Army, to the CIA, and now the Department of Energy. I had the great honor of teaching at your alma mater, West Point. And I know Dr. Fingar mentioned, I wrote it down here, he said it wasn't a NIC decision. You know, you were privy to this. Whose decision was it to declassify or to not declassify this report? Well, we, as one of the 16 agencies in the intelligence community, of course, we participated in the discussion about both on the content and then in the consensus on how to handle it. And I would just have to echo Dr. Fingar's comments that we, of course, supported that decision. I think can I just drill down real quick? Of the 16 entities, though, was it someone from those 16 agencies that said we shouldn't we should not declassify this, or was it someone above those agencies? I'm not privy to the specific details other than the fact that we all participated in the process of both drafting the doc, particularly the Department of Energy with our national laboratories in particular. Our primary contributions to the NIA were scientific expertise, as you'd imagine, and on some levels, and computer modeling, and then, of course, also as an intelligence entity within the Department of Energy. So I would defer to my colleague Matt on any further drilling down on that process of classifying it. I'm sure you understand we're a little bit perplexed why we did not declassify this document, why it was classified to begin with.
Well, again, has been alluded to, at a National Intelligence Board meeting, all the 16, which is chaired by the Director of National Intelligence, all the 16 agencies sit around a table, and one of the questions deals with the classification and the release, so on, to allies. In that session, there was a unanimous agreement by all the agencies to not declassify this report.
It was a unanimous decision to classify it.
To keep it classified, yes.
Okay. So make sure. Okay, I want to change over to the Armed Services head here. If you could elaborate on as far as what you think the most significant impact on U.S. Homeland Security, specifically as relates to when you look at global warming, the rising of the water. A lot of our military bases are on the coastline. When you look at San Diego shipbuilding, when you look at Connecticut, Groton shipbuilding there as well, but also the other military bases, the Marine Corps and the Army. Could you elaborate on that effect on Homeland Security and any implications there?
Okay, we actually identified three areas, broad areas, where the impact would be greatest on U.S. homeland, and that was dealing with the drought in the Southwest. Then secondly, the infrastructure along the East Coast, and this would be affected by storm surge.
And third?
And third was dealt with these installations as well as nuclear power plants. And most of them are located, I mean, the military installations that we looked at are located along the coast, so it's linked with the second.
What recommendations does the panel have that this Congress should be aware of, that we should move forward on when you look at those three areas that you targeted?
Well, as members of the intelligence community, we don't make policy recommendations. I mean, we tell you what we think is based upon the climate science and also what the the data tells us about possible threats. We don't actually recommend particular steps to be taken.
So in your professional judgment, you can't give us an idea on what we could do to mitigate potential damages of global warming?
No, I mean, first place, we wouldn't be, that's not our job, but also in the second place, as we've talked about here, we didn't actually look at mitigating strategies in any depth.
Okay. I see the balance of my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to get something down for the record that I think is really very important, especially around this whole area of confidence levels in NIEs, and in this case, the NIA. And that is on Iraq having chemical and biological weapons and was close to making a nuclear weapon. Of course, this was all put out in the run-up and the rationale to invade Iraq. That was high confidence. So I think that we need to understand the context of these things, and maybe even remember the old Boy Scout motto, be prepared. And I think if this discussion is about anything, it's about using the science, not political science, but using the science and the best minds of our intelligence community to be prepared and to map out a plan not only for our own country, but to work with nations around the world, because it threatens the entire global community. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nuclear winter, or the lack of it, has been brought up twice by members on the other side of the aisle as a relevant example of alarmist predictions that never took place. Well, I'm delighted that nuclear winter never took place, but the very fact that nuclear winter was brought up in this context shows a complete lack of understanding of what nuclear winter pertains to, namely that it's a consequence of nuclear war, which helps explain some of the gross misunderstandings we're seeing with regard to the national security and economic implications of global warming. Now, much better analogies are CFC emissions impacting outer atmosphere ozone and acid rain. In both of these cases, national action and global cooperation mitigated the threat without destroying the U.S. economy, contrary to the dire predictions of the same critics who believe that mitigating climate change will have dire consequences to our economy. Now, Dr. Burrows, you wrote in the testimony, I assume that you were at least participating in that, that as scientific modeling improves, intelligence agencies will see more valuable studies and more valuable data. Are there any scientific capabilities needed that don't exist and for which none is being developed?
Well, on the as far as scientific capabilities in the intelligence community, I think Dr. Fingar explained. I mean, what we are looking at is using the capabilities outside the intelligence community on this issue of climate change. We are not looking to develop within the intelligence community, particularly scientific capabilities, because we see that as a duplication and probably not a very good use.
Well, are there capabilities that need to be developed that aren't being developed that you could identify?
I'm not qualified on a scientific side to say what scientific capabilities need to be developed. I can tell you, as we've put out in the testimony, areas where we would like to put more of our effort in looking at the security implications. But I can't tell the scientific community outside what they should be doing.
Sir, if I can add to that,
Sure.
I think your question really touches on a very important philosophical point. The ownership of this problem in particular touches on all communities. The intelligence community undoubtedly has a role to follow the NIA, but so do, for example, the Department of Energy National Laboratories. We have extensive capabilities. I can't speak to all of them, but things like computer modeling, renewable and energy efficiency technologies, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, system dynamics analysis, World Data Center, atmospheric trace gas, just a sampling of capabilities in our own national laboratories. There, the cultures is great transparency of collaboration internationally with foreign partners, foreign countries, foreign scientists. And I think one thing the intelligence community can do to build on some of the discussion up to this point is exploit our open source, open innovation capabilities to bring all that in as best possible to improve our baseline. The NIA is a baseline, is not the end product of where we're going to end up on this. And the key is this international collaboration, private-public sector partnership.
Well, it was recommended that the intelligence community should conduct a scenario exercise. Aren't these scenario exercises already being conducted?
Yes. I mean, we routinely conduct scenario exercises. This pertains to scenarios, not scientific scenarios, but ones dealing with implications of security, political and economic, and so on. And we do that, as the testimony indicated, we would like to do more of this, particularly when it pertains to this issue of climate change.
Well, much of the oral testimony had to do, that Dr. Fingar gave, had to do with the methodology. How confident are you, and this is a question that's been circulating this morning, how confident are you of the methodology that was used?
I think we're highly confident of the methodology that was used, just for the purposes that I think all of us have related, is that we went out and sought out as best we could the expertise on outside, both in terms of the science and secondly in also using outside experts along with IC experts to determine the implications. But you know, this is as we put in the report, this is an imprecise science. I mean, you're dealing with a 20-year projection. There are a lot of factors. You cannot be totally certain of how these things will work out.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Burrows, you just said you had high confidence in your methodology. Dr. Fingar said that he was working from the mid-level assessment of the IPCC, which is a document that has been accepted by our government and is a consensus of scientists from countries around the world. And that was corroborated by peer review by the Climate Change Science Program, Department of Energy National Laboratories, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, or NOAA, none of which are tree-hugging environmental groups, by the way, to my knowledge. Also, the University of Maryland, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, the Naval Postgraduate School, et cetera, et cetera. At what point and by whom was this rating of low to moderate confidence given to the report?
Well, this happens in the cases of all national intelligence assessments and estimates.
I just want a simple answer because I only have 4 minutes.
Okay, it's done at the final stage of the coordination process. This is a working level coordination.
By whom, please?
All the agency reps at the coordination session.
Love to know the names of those people. In terms of low confidence or moderate confidence, how confident are you right now that the Mississippi River is flooding and 300-plus miles are closed to shipping due to the high water levels?
High confidence.
How confident are you that 5 Boy Scouts were sucked up in a tornado and killed in the last few weeks? Rhetorical questions, okay. How confident are you that there's an early fire season starting and raging in the Rockies and California mountains? How confident are we that a typhoon just killed 800 people on a cruise ship or a ferry in the Philippines, and shortly before that, a cyclone killed many people in Myanmar? How confident are we that there is a drought in Georgia and North Florida that was so severe that last year they had to close nuclear power plants because there wasn't enough water for the cooling system? Remember that?
Yeah, these are all facts.
Now, your report says, quote, increased intensity and frequency of severe weather events, unquote, are likely. How confident are you that these phenomena we're witnessing in seemingly more and more frequent sequence could fit the model that your report describes of increased intensity and frequency of storms?
I am not on that level of confidence.
Sir, to the point on the low, moderate confidence, I think it's very important to note that that assessment is based on the variability of the science, is not to suggest that it's conservative or pessimistic, but that in fact, as we know more about the science, as the science is a greater consensus across the board, we may in fact determine that we've underestimated the threat as much as we may have overestimated.
Well, thank
so there's
you
no
for saying.
suggestion in low to moderate that the problem is not real.
Well, thank you for saying that you may have underestimated. I'm glad to have that on the record. The one thing I agree with my minority colleagues about is that this report should be declassified in its entirety with no redacting. I didn't see anything that I thought needed to be redacted.
Sir, there's one thing in the report, if I might add, just to your point, that it talks specifically about factors that may dramatically change our assessment, tipping points, if you are. Those are included in the reports as illustrations of some of the variations of viewpoints that still may ultimately greatly affect the outcome of our assessment.
Right, and the more information is withheld from the public, the harder it will be to convince people that climate change is happening and that we need to make the right decisions, not only for our national security, but for our economic security. We could have invented the Prius here, but decisions made by our government and our industries allow somebody else to get to that hybrid technology first, and we are suffering from it, and our national security is suffering through the increased use of foreign oil and the flow of dollars overseas. I want to ask one last question because I know I'm going to run out of time on the answer. The scenarios described today by you with potentially the U.S. potentially being drawn into humanitarian interventions because of refugees of climate change crossing boundaries in our hemisphere, among others. the necessity for the United States to referee fights over water throughout the globe are truly daunting. As we have seen in Iraq, a large sustained military effort has had a draining effect on our military and National Guard. I'm curious what your thoughts are under the scenarios laid out in the report. What would our military end strength need to be to address these new challenges while still meeting traditional national security demands? How much additional spending would that require?
Well, again, we can't make any recommendations on specific spending requirements. What we indicated there was that in view of the conclusions that we drew, that humanitarian situations were more likely to occur in the future, and the U.S. would be probably, as you say, drawn into it. And that is the extent of the analysis and judgments.
I might add to that as well that I think that question specifically raises the broader question of what will policymakers need in the future to answer questions like that, and what will they need from us. And I think a very simple response to that is adequate forecast, foresight, and warning. In a classic intelligence context, how long ahead of problems will they need that foresight and warning, and what will it consist of?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I just want to close by saying I hope that the modest economic benefits that you show the United States gaining from global warming do not include the flooding of Cedar Rapids or the 3 50-year floods in the last 5 years in my district in New York. And I yield
Gentleman's
back.
time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you. I was just reading the doctor's report. It says, we judge global climate change will have wide-ranging implications for U.S. national security interests over the next 20 years. Climate change could threaten domestic stability in some states, potentially contribute to intra or less likely interstate conflict, particularly over access to increasingly scarce water resources. We judge that economic migrants will perceive additional reasons to migrate because of harsh climates, both within nations and from disadvantaged to richer countries. Now those, I don't think you have to be an intelligence or secret agent with classified experience to recognize as a security concern of the United States. And I want to ask you about what we're doing about that. Many of us believe we should stop global warming so we can eliminate or reduce these security threats to the United States. And I want to ask how we can go about that. I want to refer to a chart. This is a chart showing our research budgets for a variety of national enterprises. On the left is the chart for the research budget. Beth, can you hold this over here a second point? This is the hold up a little bit more, please. This is the research budget for the United States for our entire energy R&D research budget. You see it peaked in 1980. It's gone down since then. It's about $3 billion a year. This is the research budget for our health expenditures in the United States. It's up to about $34 billion a year. On the right is our traditional DoD research and development budget. We'll see it's gone up precipitously. It is now in excess of about $82 billion. We're spending about $82 billion a year on R&D on weapons system, but we're spending $3 billion a year trying to prevent the most massive weaponized system against the very climate system upon which life depends on the planet Earth. And to me, there's a serious question whether or not we are doing adequate research and development to prevent this security threat to the United States. If you think RPGs, with all their terror, are in Afghanistan and Iraq, this weapon system that we are unleashing on the world is going to have national security implications well beyond any localized conflict. I think your report makes that clear. And yet we're spending peanuts, crumbs, or less. We're spending 55 times more money fighting a war in Iraq in this oil-rich region than we are trying to figure out a way to stop climate change and developing a clean energy future for the country. So it's a bit rhetorical, but I'll just ask the gentleman or gentlelady to comment about whether or not having an adequate research and development budget to build a clean energy technology for the United States, to prevent global warming, to prevent the internecine conflicts in the Sudan that are raging today over water. Not 20 years from now. They're fighting over grass and water in the Sudan and Darfur today. We're experiencing forest fires in Alaska, in Georgia, and floods. We're experiencing rainfall that closed the Mount Rainier National Park for the first time in 140 years. Today, not 2030. So I'll just ask you, do you think it makes sense, given the security implications of global warming, that we do a little better job on a research and development budget to make it consistent with the nature of this threat?
I think, as Dr. Burrows indicated, we in the intelligence community don't make proposals about what policymakers should decide. But I think after doing this report, the one thing that became very clear is a lot of this is about trade-offs. And one of the reasons we did such a more than a 20-year projection is because some of the decisions that will be made will need a long time horizon in order to get any impact. When you're talking about the food and fuel crisis today, any solutions to that crisis, if implemented today, would take 10, 15 years to pan out. So it's all about trade-offs, and it's all about thinking about, if you make one decision on mitigation or adaptation, what are the implications of that? And I think that's what we were beginning to unpack in this assessment.
Well, just let me ask you for your thoughts. I understand your limitations, but doesn't it seem to you that if we can prevent a very significant increase in worldwide tensions, and I think it's very clear that this is going to cause a very significant increase in worldwide tensions, which have the possibility to result in conflicts that one way or another we get dragged into. We got troops all over the globe because of local tensions that have boiled over or may boil over. Doesn't it make sense to try to prevent those tensions from developing, to try to reduce national security concerns in the United States? And isn't R&D budget critical to that?
I would add, taking that to a broader level of providing the kind of information to policymakers to inform decisions, whether that's over R&D budgets or over decisions of where to put our priorities, and I agree with my colleague. We have to think of those things in a much broader sense. And one of the things that hasn't come up today is that this effort, if we're going to understand global warming in the proper context, beyond the science, it's going to involve, has to involve a multidisciplinary, global, international type approach, bringing best knowledge everywhere, to put that into information that we get better at providing over time to our policymakers so they can make informed decisions.
We got a lot of knowledge. We just don't have any action after 8 years of this administration. We're going to start that in the next one. Thank you.
Gentlemen's time has expired, and all time for questions of this excellent first panel has expired. We thank you so much for the work which you have done in presenting this information to us. Again, on a bipartisan basis, we are going to be making a request to you to declassify this document, not to you specifically, but to the administration, so that we can have a fuller discussion of the basis upon which this analysis has been made. With the thanks of both committees, we will now move on to the second panel. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
The second panel consists of 4 or 5 very distinguished citizens of the world, but because of time constraints and her inability to stay with us for a longer period of time, I would like to ask that we allow our first witness to give her testimony. She is the Right Honorable Margaret Beckett. Mrs. Beckett is joining us today in her personal capacity as the former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom. We understand that you will have to leave after providing your testimony. Mrs. Beckett, we welcome you. We thank you for joining us today, and we thank you for your service to our planet in your time in public office. Whenever you are comfortable, please begin your testimony.
Thank you, sir. I've been listening with great interest to the latter part of your first panel, and I'll be as brief as I can because of the pressures on your time and mine. I think at present we're getting a sharp reminder of the impact of insecurity whether it's energy insecurity, food insecurity, water insecurity, and the impact that can have across the world and how it's fostering instability. For example, we've seen food riots in many countries across the world. About a year ago, as Foreign Secretary, I chaired the first UN Security Council debate on the relationship between climate change and peace and security. Some 55 countries took part in it, an unprecedentedly large number for such a Security Council debate, with the Secretary General and all his senior staff. And it was the representative from the Congo who said during that debate, this won't be the first time people have fought over land, water and resources, but this time it will be on a scale that dwarfs the conflicts of the past. And certainly we take the view that the impact on the global economy, to which I've just heard your colleagues refer, on conflict, on the risks of conflict and climate change are all linked together. We're seeing a resource crunch across the world at the moment. We're seeing perhaps structural shifts in the global economy, which may require a structural shift in response. And we feel that all of these things reinforce the need to address climate change. I heard one of your witnesses, I think, indicate that energy security and climate security go hand in hand. Tackle one and you're tackling the other. As we look across the world, in the UK, it's clear that there are countries that have greater or lesser abilities to tackle some of the impacts that we believe will bite, but it's also clear the Stern report that the British government published, commissioned a year ago, indicates that it will not cost the earth to change our economies in a direction which can help us tackle the impact of climate change, but it could if we don't. He assessed then the minimum cost at about 5% of global GDP of inaction on climate change. He now says he thinks he was too optimistic. My final point is that climate change, certainly I see, and the British government has seen, is a threat multiplier. It interacts with other problems that already exist, interacts to make them worse. Pressures on migration, as again has been mentioned already in your committee. And less than a week ago, the second most senior official in our Ministry of Defence made the point at a meeting in London that our Defence Ministry sees these issues as a real threat to our national security, and we see that as being the case across the world. Thank you.
We thank you very much. Would it be possible for you to answer a couple of questions from
Sure.
the committees? Great. Let me just ask you how you found the British public's understanding of the security implications of global warming and whether or not it helped to inform the discussion of policy solutions in your country.
I think the people understand the issue. What they don't understand yet is the urgency. There's a tendency to assume this will be a problem for our children. So that makes it a moral dilemma, but not necessarily the recognition of the fact that it can be a problem for us within 5, 10, 20 years. And again, perhaps a better recognition of the impact on migration than on some of the other issues, although every day, as the resource crunch continues, concern about food insecurity, water insecurity, energy insecurity is increasing.
Well, let me turn and recognize the ranking Republican on the committee, Mr. Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin.
Thank you very much, Madam Foreign Minister. As you may know, I have somewhat of a skeptical view of this entire issue, and I am deeply concerned about the impacts on the economies and on the people of some of the changes that have been proposed. You may recall that sometime this winter the European Commission reduced the cap on carbon emissions for EU countries including the United Kingdom. And shortly thereafter, the Times of London ran a story that said that this would cost the British electric generating industry approximately 6 billion British pounds or 12 billion US dollars per year in order to buy the carbon offset credits necessary. And of course, all of this would end up being passed on to ratepayers and consumers of electricity. Furthermore, this story indicated that about 2/3 of the credits would be purchased outside the European Union. This is not a free lunch, and I am wondering what the British government is proposing to help residential ratepayers, particularly those on fixed incomes, who pay for this huge increase in the cost of electricity that they're going to need to light their homes and maybe even heat them.
I think everybody would share your concern if it was believed that in the round there would be a very damaging and only a damaging economic impact. And you picked up quite rightly on the increase in energy costs. The British government already does give extra help, particularly to the least well-off, the elderly, to the most vulnerable, and is looking all the time at how much more can be done and when it can be done. But I think I would stress that although for those who, like me, are believers in the science, it would be much more difficult if we believed that the net impact, the overall impact, would just be damaging. But we, many of us, believe that in fact, if you look at the position in the round, there are advantages as well as disadvantages. Let me give you a specific example. It's now very much predicted that ice in the Arctic will disappear faster than anyone had imagined. That can cause problems, but also, of course, it could create new trade passages. It could free up the availability of greater resources. And one of the challenges for the world community is to try to see that the availability, for example, of those trade routes, of those resources, doesn't feed conflict and instability by trying to encourage international cooperation. So yes, of course, there will be some damaging impacts, but there are huge opportunities too, not least for those who are the first movers in the industries, in the technological developments that will be required.
About 6 billion pounds of higher electricity costs in a country the size of the United Kingdom is a lot of money, and it's going to impact people who are the least likely to pay the most. If all of a sudden next month's electricity bill will be 2 or 3 times their current electricity bill. Is the government prepared to have a welfare program that is that vast in order to prevent people like this from frankly going broke or freezing during the winter?
Well, as I said, Mr. Sensenbrenner, the government does in fact have such a program, although I no longer speak for the government. But can I add that, yes, there is an impact on the cost of the electricity companies. Those same companies have made similarly large sums of money over the last few years in terms of extra profits. And there is much discussion about how they can work with the government to help those who are most vulnerable. So that is constantly kept under review, and that will always be the case in every country. I assure you, I am as conscious of the need to get re-elected as any politician. So yes, of course, we recognize these impacts, but there is another side to the coin which is not always recognized.
Thank you.
Great. Gentlemen's time has expired. If you don't mind, the other members of the committee, we'll just recognize members for 2 minutes for questions from Mrs. Beckett, so that I know she has to leave, and we could still accommodate the other witnesses on this panel. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mrs. Beckett, for joining us. I think that you not only honor us, but you grace this very important hearing. And we all want to salute you for the incredible role that you've played and the contributions that you've made. And I just couldn't mean that more. And I'm so delighted that you are with us today. As a former secretary and now as chair of the Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, you've been the principal user of national intelligence as well as being responsible for its oversight. Today, as you know, we are examining the marriage, the bringing together of national security and the whole issue of climate change. Can you tell us what sort of information or judgments related to climate change do policymakers need from their intelligence services? I'm sure you've already heard and picked up on the diminishment of even bringing the two together, that we have so many other things to do in the world, and this tinkering around with whether temperatures go up or down, and perhaps some inexact parts of the science. We need to leapfrog over this stuff and really get to important things. Can you comment on that and kind of fill in the blank as to what you think, what sort of information or judgments we need to bring about, and the cooperation of the international communities, intelligence communities?
I think the main thing that can be contributed by the international communities, intelligence communities at present, is in the area of analysis. I understand, I sympathize very much with those who say there are lots of important challenges. Is this so immediate? All I can tell you is that it is factored into the work, the analysis of what governments believe are the problems they're going to face, the analysis of what they are likely to do in order to begin to address those problems. For example, I heard mention of India. I'm told that India has begun to construct an 8-foot fence along their border with Bangladesh, no doubt partly as a matter of concern about migration. The department I previously headed, the Department of Agriculture, has worked for a long time with the Chinese government about the threats to their food supply that climate change poses. This is a huge issue. It was a Chinese ambassador who said to me many years ago that when you're the leader of China, the first thing you think in the morning is, can I feed my people today? Because if you can't, you are in serious difficulty. This kind of understanding is factored into the work and the analysis of our intelligence community. And, for example, our forward policy planners in the Ministry of Defence and in the Foreign Office are working now on an assessment of impacts in the Arctic, which I believe they're hoping to share with your own community perhaps in the autumn. Similarly, they're thinking about the impact in the Arabian Peninsula. Huge implications there, not least in the Nile Valley, Nile Delta, of sea level rise, salination, and so on. All things that are likely to lead to pressures on economies as well as on peoples.
Thank you very much.
We thank you. Gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Chair, I appreciate your testimony here today, and I'll try to be very, very brief in my questions and make them British-centric. When we talk about the problem, we'll accept that it's going to happen if we don't stop putting CO2 into our atmosphere. Based on that, Europe has led the way in nuclear increases in nuclear energy, while the United States has not built a new one since 1979. First, how would you caution us on the fact that currently the vast majority of our energy is produced by CO2 emitting systems, 51% of which is coal? Secondly, and this is much more directed to Great Britain, you're presently an oil exporting country, essentially exporting carbon, to be knowing that it will be outgassed throughout the world. One, do you think that Great Britain should take a role by only using domestic oil and in fact not exporting North Sea oil? Last but not least, in the alternative, if you still wanted to export it, don't you think you have a responsibility to pay cap and trade on, in fact, the export of that carbon, knowing that it's going to be put into the atmosphere?
Well, insofar as there's a cap and trade system in the world, the UK will participate in it. With regard to using just our own oil, I'm no expert, but I understand that for many countries and many uses, it's a mixture of oils that is required. And it's not always possible simply to source everything domestically, no matter how much oil you have. And I understand your point about dependence, for example, on coal. One of the technologies which we would like to see not just developed but used is carbon capture and storage, where work is going on in the UK, in the European Union, and I understand in the United States.
Now, I appreciate that, Madam Chair, but you said you had to deal with this in 5 to 10 years. In 5 to 10 years, developing science can't be an answer. What would you do today to reduce the size of the carbon footprint of your own country and ours?
The biggest thing that we can do is to increase our energy efficiency. If you look, for example, at what Japan has achieved, that is a tremendous step forward. Equally, we are, and I believe the government is likely to make a statement soon, we are likely to put greater input into renewables. I understand your point about nuclear energy, but of course, although the British government is now committed to that expansion, that itself will take some 15, 20 years or so. So energy efficiency and renewables are very much the way for us at this moment in time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentlemen.
Thank you. I have to go, I fear, sir.
Well,
I think all politicians understand the pressure of the vote and the whips.
No, we're honored that you were able to spend the time with us that you have so far, and your contributions globally to understanding of this issue and giving us political leadership is something that we respect very greatly here in the United States, and we thank you, and we understand.
Thank you very much.
The pressures that you're under. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor. I'm sorry I couldn't spend longer with you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes now the gentleman from New Jersey for the purposes of recognizing one of his constituents.
Chair Markey and Chair Eshoo, I appreciate your giving the floor to me to present to you retired Vice Admiral Paul Gaffney. I think you could not find someone better qualified to testify today to share wisdom on this subject.
Thank you. Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, you could not find someone better qualified to testify today and share wisdom on this subject. Retired Vice Admiral Gaffney has had a career applying science and technology to our nation's security as Chief of Naval Research, as Commander of the Naval Research Lab, as a distinguished oceanographer, as a charter member relevant to this subject of MEDIA, applying national technical means to understanding our Earth and its climate, and as a member of the CNA study on national security and climate change. I also think you will appreciate Admiral Gaffney's scientific approach to this issue, and I must say I am delighted to see him here today to welcome someone who contributes so much to our national security, but also to the general welfare of New Jersey.
Great. We thank you. Why don't you begin your testimony, Admiral Gaffney, and then we'll recognize the other witnesses as well.
Chairman Markey, Chairwoman Eshoo, my Congressman Holt, thank you, sir, very much. Does so many great things for our university and members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to appear this morning. I have submitted a formal testimony. I'll just try to briefly summarize by discussing first, just briefly, the 2007 CNA report on the threat of climate change to national security, and then to opine, give you my opinion on the value of leveraging defense and intelligence capabilities and data to both better measure the progress or even the non-progress of global climate change, and to inform climate change policy and planning, especially security planning. Let me start with the CNA part. I was a member of the Military Advisory Board that sat with the CNA as it developed its report, and I'd like to submit that report for the record. I think you've all seen it maybe for months. The report on security and climate change does not judge whether or how much climate is changing, does not judge whether mankind is responsible for it or whether humans can turn it around. Rather, it points to the international and regional security consequences of climate change if the disturbing environmental signals that we have been measuring in our sophisticated last few years continue unabated. The report likens the threat of climate change to that of the strategic threats we endured during the Cold Wars, in that the probability of disastrous climate change cannot be determined with absolute certainty. But the effects of climate change, if current trends continue, on international security can be so great that one must prepare, plan, if you will, to deal with them. It finds that the least developed nations of the world are most likely to be affected by climate change phenomena and the least likely to be able to cope with it eventually or even start to adapt to it now. In the report, we call for deliberate planning by the U.S. security organizations, meaning combatant commanders, intelligence agencies, etc. I personally think that it is most useful if the climate science community at large can be as specific as possible in predicting climate change regional effects. Climate change may prove to be a global phenomena, but it will be, I think, far from average. In some regions it will be much warmer, in others much colder, especially if we have an abrupt climate change event, as has been discussed over the last 5 or 6 years in the North Atlantic. In places it'll be wetter, other places drier, some places stormier, etc. The question is, what will those changes be regionally so that U.S. security leaders can deliberately include expected results, predicted results, in their plans? To that end, I have seen the value of leveraging the talent, sensors, analytical and computational capabilities, and the data collected and the data archived by the defense and intelligence agencies. I saw that specifically and firsthand throughout the 90s, from about 1991 through 2000, as a participant with Medea and its related groups. I see some benefits. Previously unreleased data and information from national security systems, national technical means, if you will, and others, may help climate scientists at large get a fuller or clearer picture of what is going on in nature. And it is important, I think, increasingly, as we wrestle with climate change predictions. It's also important as we craft regionally specific plans. And secondly, scientists and decision makers within the national security community may get better insight into their own security mission-related challenges, not necessarily affected by climate change at all, by conferring with top civil scientists who have received security clearances and have access to capabilities. Certainly, deliberate acts of reviewing and releasing data or deriving unclassified products from that data, from unreleasable data, will cost something. But such costs would be considerably less than replicating data collection otherwise. This cost-benefit point is more important when one considers the stakes involved in either underestimating the effects of or overreacting to climate change or their security jeopardizing regional effects. If I can quote from former Speaker Newt Gingrich in his recent book, "We cannot afford to be wrong about climate change." If national security leaders are to make actionable regional security plans that consider climate change, they need to know with the highest available degree of specificity the effects for their respective theaters. In these most troubled parts of the world that we worry about most, governments are probably not prepared and maybe not willing to collect sophisticated long time series data. Yes, the successes of Medea are about a decade old, and many new sensors have come into being in the civil and the commercial world. I have recently seen unclassified compilations of open source collectors that can help us monitor the environment in this particular case. But the national security communities may have different flexibilities in satellite orbits, undersea access, resolutions, just a couple of examples. And they may also have, and probably have, useful archives that go back years and generations to fill in gaps. It's worth a look, I think. The climate change debate is serious. Potential effects are also serious. And for regional security reasons, we should plan for it. But to plan, we need to use the best measurements and the best data. We should leverage our best sources from all agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Gaffney, very much.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask that the CNA report in its entirety be placed in the record of our hearing today?
Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes the next, Lee Lane, who is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Lane's research focuses on a range of issues related to climate policy, and he was the executive director of the Climate Policy Center from 2000 to 2007. Mr. Lane, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a great honor to be here. I'd like to thank both chairpersons, the ranking members, and all the members of both committees for the opportunity to discuss these issues with you today. I'm Lee Lane. I'm resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. AEI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization conducting research and education on public policy issues. AEI does not adopt institutional positions on issues, and the views that I'm going to express here this morning are solely my own. I think the committees are to be commended for addressing the issues covered in this hearing. Climate change is one of the most important and certainly one of the most difficult problems facing the world. I've worked for the last 8 years on developing economically efficient solutions to us. I think all of us are concerned with American national security. So the committees have clearly focused on matters of prime importance in the intersection of two very important concerns. My remarks really can be summarized in 3 points, which I would like to do briefly here. First, climate change poses a very serious long-term problem. However, I have questions about whether looking at it through the lens of national security may not provide something less than the most useful perspective for viewing it. Some have worried that by worsening environmental and resource problems in very poor nations, climate change may pose a risk to U.S. national security. Ecological problems in poor countries are, in fact, troubling and from many reasons, many points of view. But within the next 20 years or so, expected global warming is likely to have only a fairly modest effect on these problems, all of which would exist were no warming expected to occur whatever. Moreover, as many distinguished economists have pointed out, in the near term, efforts targeted at directly alleviating the underlying environmental stresses and poverty are likely to be far more cost-effective than attempts to reduce greenhouse gases will be. This is not to say that reducing greenhouse gases aren't extremely important in the long run, but, and this is my second point, a balanced climate policy requires careful consideration of both the costs of mitigation and its benefits. Imposing very rapid emissions cuts are likely to impose significant burdens on the American economy, but more importantly still, if China and India don't join in efforts to curb emissions, our sacrifices will lead little or no environmental benefit. Furthermore, attempts to use trade sanctions to coerce China and India and other nations to adopt greenhouse gas limits seem to me to be likely to add to international conflict, not to alleviate it. Finally, some of the technologies that look to be important as potential solutions to the problem of climate change carry risks of their own. Certainly, a substantial expansion of nuclear power raises questions and concerns about proliferation, as Chairman Markey has already alluded to. and expanding biofuels production, if that indeed turns out to be part of the solution, raises the specter of squeezing global food supply, another serious problem. The real point I'm trying to make here is just that trade-offs are inevitable in climate policy, and that's part of why it becomes such a difficult policy problem. Third, new technologies will be the key to success, but halting climate change requires zero net emissions from the global economy. Zero net emissions. Today's technologies are not even close to being able to meet this goal at reasonable cost, nor will incremental improvements in those technologies suffice. Devising new transformational technologies and diffusing them globally could easily consume the remainder of this century. As time passes and emissions continue, the risk grows that high-impact, abrupt climate change might appear. I will simply conclude, since I notice my time has expired here, by noting that there is possibly a family of technologies that might be able to produce a rather rapid global cooling, even in a high greenhouse gas world.
We will come back to you in the question and answer period. Thank you. Our next witness is Marlo Lewis. He is a senior fellow in the Competitive Enterprise Institute, where his work includes global warming and energy security. Dr. Lewis is no stranger to Capitol Hill, having previously served as staff director of the House Government Reform Subcommittee on Regulatory Affairs. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and Mr. Chairman. It is a real honor for me to be here today. Push. Thank you. It's a real honor for me to be here today. Thank you very much. My testimony develops two simple points. First, there are security risks associated with climate change, but also security risks associated with climate change policy. And that leads to my second point, which is that the intelligence community should assess not only the potential impacts of climate change on national security, but also the potential impacts of climate policies on national security. Let's start with DoD, the single largest consumer of energy in the world. Rising energy costs already force DoD to economize in ways it never had to do in the era of $30 oil or even $60 oil. What happens if cap-and-trade programs push fuel costs even higher? Would DoD have to reduce the number and scope of training exercises, for example? Maybe not, but it's a risk, and the intelligence community should assess it. Consider a more fundamental risk. Money, an old adage tells us, is the sinews of war. Economic power is the foundation of military power. Economic might was critical to winning the Cold War, and the Second World War, and the First World War. In democratic politics, moreover, there's always a trade-off between guns and butter. It's harder in bad economic times to raise funds needed to recruit, train, and equip the armed forces. Rising unemployment and malaise can foster isolationism. The recently debated Lieberman-Warner bill would require a 70% reduction in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Other legislation would go further. Yet, as a forthcoming CEI analysis shows, for the economy to keep growing at 2.2% a year and achieve a 70% reduction in emissions would require U.S. carbon intensity to decline almost 4 times faster than it has over the historic period of the last 45 years. So maybe, just maybe, big cuts in emissions can't really be achieved without big cuts in economic growth. If climate policy harms our economy, it could also sap our military strength. We've heard today that climate change could adversely affect natural resource availability, and we could see increased conflict among nations and within nations over resources like water and food. But climate policy also has a high potential to produce conflict. Vice President Gore says the whole world must reduce its emissions 50% by 2050. Since most emissions growth in the 21st century will come from developing countries, this goal may not be achievable without, for example, prohibiting China and other developing countries from building coal-fired power plants. Already, some U.S. and European leaders are calling for carbon tariffs to penalize goods from China and India. Here's a warning. Trade wars don't always end peacefully. If America adopts this anti-coal policy toward the world, we will continually butt heads with China and many other developing countries. We've heard today that climate change could cause crop failure and food shortages and internal chaos in some countries. Well, during the past year, food riots have broken out in more than 30 countries. In at least one instance, Haiti, rioters brought down the government. And one factor fueling this crisis is a global warming policy, biofuel subsidies and mandates. We're only at the baby steps of this policy. If we ramp it up and in addition limit developing countries' access to fossil energy, we could possibly condemn millions to poverty and misery. Not a good way to promote stability and peace in the world. A much-touted study on abrupt climate change warned that a deep freeze in the North Atlantic would limit access to oil and gas and force poor nations to go nuclear, increasing the risk of proliferation. Well, a global moratorium on coal generation could do very much the same. Most cap-and-trade advocates are staunchly anti-nuke. But do they really suppose poor nations will consent to a ban on coal as an electricity fuel and not demand access to nuclear power? We often hear that coastal flooding from sea level rise could create millions of refugees in low-lying countries like Bangladesh. But climate policy might actually make Bangladesh more vulnerable to sea level rise. In 2006, Bangladesh's economy was $55 billion and growing at 6% a year. At that rate, Bangladesh's economy will be $1 trillion in 2050 and $18.5 trillion in 2100, the miracle of compound interest. But suppose...
Please summarize.
Okay, I'll summarize. If Bangladesh adopts a carbon tax and its growth rate falls by just 1 percentage point, its economy will be less than half the size in the year 2100. It will be less able to protect its citizens from sea level rise or handle other critical environmental challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis, very much. And our final witness, Kent Hughes Butts, a professor of political military strategy at the U.S. Army War College. Dr. Butts previously taught at the U.S. Military Academy and is the author of Climate Change, Complicating the Struggle Against Extremist Ideology, and he has a chapter in the recent book, Global Climate Change, National Security Implications. We welcome you, Dr. Butts.
Chairman Markey, Chairwoman Eshoo, members of the committee. I'm honored to be able to contribute to the hearings of the committee on the recent NIA on national security implications of global climate change to 2030. I appreciate the opportunity to respond to your questions concerning the NIA, the concerns of the military planners, and how the intelligence and military communities could plan for the various climate change scenarios. My testimony today reflects my personal views and does not necessarily reflect the views of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the administration. Climate change has surfaced as a critical security issue in the post-Cold War era. While conflict between nation-states remains central to security studies, security strategists now see that the regional stability depends on governments maintaining legitimacy and meeting the basic needs of their populations. The effects of climate change can overwhelm the capacity of fledgling democracies to meet those needs. Because climate change may worsen existing tensions and help destabilize regions, it is a worthy topic for intelligence community research, military planning, and interagency cooperation. I found the NIA to be a fine effort that's broad in its approach and includes the various levels of resolution concerning global climate change and security. The strategic issues are given appropriate emphasis, and the NIA spells out regional effects that could lead to instability and conflict. In this way, it encourages the security community to explore proactive approaches to security issues. Because of the breadth of the topic, the NIA needed to highlight many significant areas that would warrant their own assessments. One of these areas is determining the regional implications of global climate change for U.S. national security. Future assessments could articulate U.S. national security interests in each region and evaluate the implications of climate change for those interests. Where are there threats? What opportunities are created? While much environmental security and climate change data is open source, there are many regions where data is currently unavailable or limited. The capacity of individual governments to mitigate or adapt to climate change effects would be difficult to discern and a proper topic for future intelligence community research. In terms of relations with China, the United States is import dependent for petroleum and mineral resources and finds itself competing with China for influence and minerals access in two critical regions of the world where global climate change is increasingly apparent, the Middle East and Africa. However, the impacts of climate change create common interests among countries, such as well as competition. Because the United States is similarly dependent upon these two regions for its mineral imports, the two countries, China and the United States, could share a common interest in maintaining stability and ensuring dependable access at reasonable prices. Cooperation between the United States and China on mitigating the effects of climate change and encouraging the development of adaptation capabilities in mineral-producing regions are significant areas of cooperation that could serve as confidence-building measures between the two powers. This could also ensure a stable supply of mineral resources to an already tight world market and promote regional stability. State political systems, unable to meet the demands placed upon them by the population, struggle to maintain legitimacy and power and invite the introduction of extremist ideology. Global climate change places additional demands upon political systems that many developing states cannot meet. Scarcities of resources, lack of water, reduced agricultural capacity create underlying conditions that terrorists seek to exploit. Food riots in Cairo, at a time when members of the Muslim Brotherhood are running for re-election or for election, demonstrate the problem. Military planners are responding to the demands of their leaders for proactive approaches to these issues and the underlying conditions of terror. Planning for the impacts of global climate change in the intelligence and military communities should balance high-impact, low-probability scenarios with low-probability, high-impact scenarios. It is important to plan for low-probability, high-impact events to identify the long lead time responses necessary to ensure U.S. national security interests. Such planning has the additional value of indicating to vulnerable countries that the U.S. takes threats to their existence seriously. As the military has learned on the battlefield, security planners need to prepare for what the threat can do, not just for what the threat is likely to do.
Dr. Bucks, we appreciate your testimony and each of the other witnesses. There are now 6 roll calls pending on the House floor that will necessitate all of our members having to go over there. So what we're going to do now is go to a round of 2 minutes of questioning from each of the members here, and we'll begin by recognizing Chairwoman Eshoo for her round of 2 minutes.
Thank you to each one of you, and for your expertise that you've brought to us and for your magnificent service to our country. To Vice Admiral Gaffney, I'd like to ask you the following question, and I have more and I'm going to put them in writing. You represent the thinking of the military. That brings an enormous amount of weight, as it were, to the subject matter at hand. What do you recommend, given all of the discussion, obviously the knowledge that you have, and I would read into the record all of your background. I mean, after reading this, no one can say, this man does not know what he's talking about. I mean, this is incredible. The role of the military in this, what would you advise our committee that in terms of intertwining the challenges of the national security challenges relative to climate change and the role of the U.S. military in the planning and the addressing of this enormous challenge that we have.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. First of all, I would recommend that the combatant commanders in the regional theaters consider environmental change, climate change in their planning, for the short term, but also for the long term. Likewise, planners inside the Defense Department that make investments in future capabilities should consider this for the long term. I also believe, and I think I said this, when you're doing planning regionally, it should not be these long, lazy curves that one sees sometimes presented by scientists, but much more regionally specific. And when you get to that, I think we need to collect the best data possible from every agency of government. And I have seen that both the Defense Department and the intelligence community has data that they're already collecting as part of their regular mission that should be reviewed to see if it's useful for this particular issue.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll be equally brief. Dr. Lewis, Dr. Butts, you seem to have a common theme. The theme was be careful what you wish for and do, because then you have to figure out how to mitigate what you did to mitigate. Fair assumption? Should this committee, as we tasked, okay, what apocalyptic events could happen if the temperature rises 7 degrees, or, as I suggested earlier, 1975 scenario, it drops 7 degrees, it seems to have the same effect. Given that, and given the assumption that today's prediction is that it is a clear rise in temperature from CO2 emissions, that's sort of the given truism today, should we ask what CO2 abatements are most efficient with the least offsets and in what locations, and begin fast implementing them? And I'll give you a quick example. We can deploy wind energy anywhere in the world, and the proliferation is limited. We can deploy nuclear here in the U.S. if we have the will to, and proliferation would be non-existent. But you flip that around, okay, can you do the same in reverse? Of course not. So should we be asking the question of our best think tanks, in addition to agencies and so on, of how do we get to zero emissions as quickly as possible with the least offsets, and weigh those? And secondly, because the time is limited, don't we also have to ask what the impacts of rising food prices and so on are, and be just as concerned that those food prices are going to rise if we do exactly what we're doing today with no change? In other words, if we ignore global warming and it doesn't happen, we still have some very dangerous scenarios.
I guess I would have to say yes. I mean, it was a very multi-part question, but it's interesting. Congress may not be able to enact a cap-and-trade program yet, but it certainly has the power of the purse. And it was interesting that it pointed out earlier that we're spending $3 billion on energy technologies in this political climate in which people are saying that we could have some low probability events that could actually destroy civilization. So I mean, I'm just wondering what it says really about political reality that we can have a rhetoric that I would consider alarmist, that this is a civilization-ending peril, and yet we're only prepared to spend $3 billion to deal with it. However, what we'd really like to do is impose a regulatory system on the economy that would force people to spend trillions. There seems to be a disconnect there.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Hall, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm interested in Professor Butt's assertion that the threat of climate change could provide opportunities for multilateral cooperation, sort of the flip side of the coin that the former Secretary from the UK, Ms. Beckett, made in terms of climate change being a threat multiplier. Do you envision technology transfer programs, water security agreements, coordinated disaster response efforts? Could you elaborate on those multilateral cooperations?
Sir, all of those would qualify. I think that the mechanisms of our national security community could reach out to other nations and seek areas of cooperation and build confidence, CBMs, confidence building measures. So in areas where there may be border disputes, there may be cooperation on dealing with watershed management. In areas where there are common interests, as I mentioned, with China and the United States, how might we work together to improve development in those areas, help the governments maintain themselves in power, and prevent failed states that terrorists might take advantage of?
Thank you. And I'd just like to, I know time is short here, I just want to thank the Admiral for quoting Mr. Gingrich, that we cannot afford to be wrong about this. And I believe personally that I'd rather be wrong on the side of doing what it takes to mitigate climate change, because in the process of doing so, we'll be creating new technologies and new jobs and new industries and renewable technologies here, hopefully keeping the jobs here at home and reversing that flow of dollars that's been bleeding us for the last several years and putting us in a insecure economic and national security position. I yield back.
I thank gentlemen very much. I thank the panel for their tremendous contribution today. We apologize to you, but we did learn today that the intelligence community believes that global warming creates conditions that foster terrorism. That shocking conclusion should give even greater reason to act promptly on climate change legislation. Unfortunately, the harsh truth has been papered over in public testimony. This administration has a multicolor scheme for warnings: red, orange, yellow, green, but the administration uses another color on climate change, and that is whitewash. It does a great disservice to the American people to obscure the truth behind the cloak of phony secrecy claims. We need, on a bipartisan basis, to have this entire report declassified so that we can have the full-ranging debate, not only that the United States needs, but the entire world needs, so that we can take the action now before it's too late. We thank each of you for your contribution today. We apologize to you for the truncated nature of the hearing. But with that, this hearing is adjourned with 1 minute and 38 seconds left to go a quarter of a mile over to the House floor. Thank you.
You feeling more informed now?
No.